Hey guys, this is Kevin K with Precision Powerlifting Systems, joined by the one and only Jay Birdie of Jay Birdie Fitness. I actually started filming this a minute ago and then I realized that I couldn't draw something that I wanted to draw, so we're going to do this over. So one of the things that I've always thought about, right, is, and this is where like the internet has made fun of me a few times for it, but you cannot get stronger without neurological adaptations. But you can get stronger without the physiological adaptation of more muscle mass, right? So like when they do studies and they look at one side and they see that, you know, the trained side, let's say is the right side, is doing bicep curls, and then they test the strength on the left side gets stronger. So there's no physiological stress that allows for more muscle mass to be produced on that left side, but there's crossover, right? And we'll understand why this happens when I get into the topic of today and stuff. But you know, it's just been a question that I've always had, right? So this is why I tend to lean a lot towards like the skill acquisition aspects of training, just because I think it doesn't miss the mark quite as much if we just view physiological processes, right? So if you're just doing like a typical block periodization program and you're gonna do hypertrophy first, and you believe to be true that a larger muscle has greater potentiation to contract and display strength, there's probably some blind spots there, right? And I'm just not comfortable enough bypassing, and I'm going to explain why hypertrophy training from this viewpoint might be beneficial too. And it may not be for the reasons of just having a bigger muscle. There's a lot going on there. It's not this one-to-one trade-off, right? Just lost my train of thought of where I was going a second ago. But so the skill acquisition piece just deals a lot with those neurological effects, not just the physiological pieces. So if you just believe in the physiological pieces and you kind of leave those neurological pieces, you're just missing a lot of training. And I think once you start having like a different perspective and you start bringing that other stuff in there, it kind of gives you different reasons to try things. And I don't know, I think it's a fresh perspective, and it's where kind of the next step of progressing strength training needs to go, right? Like we had the golden age of strength science, you know, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and even 90s, but they all looked at physiological processes. It wasn't until recently that the neurological pieces started being investigated a lot more, and it's due to basically the increase in technology that we have to actually be able to view some of these things. And one of these things that I'm going to talk about is myelin. So for a long period of time, myelin was just thought to be a passive structure that surrounds neurons and synapses. I'm going to do my best to kind of explain this, how it works, but you got to understand it's just an analogy and it doesn't necessarily work this way. But basically every action that we have, so there's a researcher, Daniel Walpert, I think is his name, and his whole theory is we only have brains to move. So the whole purpose of us having an advanced brain is for us to be able to move. So he gives this example of, I think it's a type of squid, a very simple squid that has a brain, moves around, swims around, and then it finally like embeds itself on like coral or rock or something, and then it eats its brain and never moves again, right? So that's kind of his example of why that may be the brain's purpose, and that's kind of a really interesting perspective. But if it is the brain's purpose, so Nikolai Bernstein it was actually before the 60s, but it became more known in the 60s as degrees of freedom problem. So he basically came up with this theory of how the human body deals with the complexity of movements, right? So think of all your joints and how many different actions that you can actually do, right? So when you're a baby and you're learning how to walk, you're gonna fall over a bunch of times. You'll see that more like joints kind of stiffen up and it's not that nice fluid movement. It doesn't happen right away, right? So the body kind of decreases the degrees of freedom, the available options, and kind of lets you explore. And then once those available options become more comfortable, it opens up more options and then more options. So if you think of it, you know, if you're a baby, you're kind of falling over, but then all of a sudden you're 10 years old, you're starting to play sports. Then, you know, you see Patrick Mahomes or Tom Brady playing in a Super Bowl, like they've gone from falling over as babies to high level athletic performance. And that's developed over time, and it can still be developed even later in life. So basically kind of what happens is your neurons kind of send these signals. So if you think of it in terms of like if everything's just like an electrical current, right? But the thing is these these signals require such timing, and they control the force output, the order of muscle contraction, the direction of movement, the velocity of movement, all of that stuff, right? So like these signals control every movement that we do, okay? And they rely on getting feedback from the muscles, the skin, the environment, all kinds of things in order for us to be able to kind of update these signals that go in and produce that output. All right, so like as a baby, when you're falling over, those falls are that feedback a little bit. And then you kind of start getting more feedback from the bottom of your feet. You're holding on to things to learn how to stabilize a little bit better. And you're getting that feedback back on, okay, this is how we stabilize, this is how we move forward, this is, right? So you start learning those things as you go through that process. And what happens is those signals become much more efficient, but they also build a thicker myelin sheath around it. So the myelin is literally this insulation that allows for those signals to pass faster and more efficiently. So when you look at a beginner move, let's say you take, Jess, somebody who's very uncoordinated. No, but when you take a beginner and you watch them squat with a barbell, right? Their knees are caving in, they're kind of falling, they look like a fish out of water, right? They're kind of like falling all over the place and they kind of can't figure out their balance and stuff. What you're seeing there is you're seeing them kind of exploring their world and trying to figure that out a little bit, right? So their neurons, there's a lot of noise in that system. Let's use that, right? So if there's a lot of deviations of movement, they don't have stability, they're falling all over, there's just a lot of noise, right? So you have to find a way to allow them to deal with that noise and decrease the amount of noise that they're experiencing during their movements. And the reason for that is these neurons, when they're firing, so I'm gonna draw the same picture I drew before, but I'm gonna take it in a different direction. So what you actually need is thousands of neurons are doing this at one time, and their signal to turn on the next wave have to come at the exact same time within milliseconds of each other to get that movement. So if you think of it, if I'm throwing a football, right, the Super Bowl was yesterday, so it's fresh in my mind. So if I'm throwing a football, right, what I need these neurons to all hit and start that next wave of neurons and elicit a response from them all at the same time, and then the next line, and then the next line. There's thousands of them that this is happening to. But what happens is if that signal's not quick enough, and if it's not efficient enough, so if a lot of that signal's kind of floating off into space somewhere, or the timing between these neurons hitting this neuron and these ones hitting the same neuron is off, that's the difference of me completing a pass and me throwing one out of bounds or nowhere near the intended target. Like the ability to do these high-level complex athletic movements require extremely efficient and effective signaling within the brain to be able to accomplish that task. So that's kind of what happens. So with that beginner, right, so let's say this group of neurons then has to hit this group of neurons, then this group, and all of these neurons have to hit this group of neurons literally within milliseconds of each other in order to get more efficient movement. But with a beginner, right, because there's just all this, we'll say all this space here, this is what happens more. So instead of it going directly, you get some that's going up here, some that's going here, some that's going here, some that's going here, right? It's kind of going all over the place. So then we train, we fuck up a lot, we start to figure it out and I'm going to explain why it's so important to have attention and focus within a training session in order to make this work. But what happens is myelin, this sheath, is actually around these neurons, okay? So what it does is over time it gets thicker and thicker and thicker. And then so now it doesn't allow any of that energy, any of those electrical signals to dissipate, right? So they're all directed quickly and efficiently in the direction that they want to go in, right? So this is the brain's white matter technically, all right? And this is what we're trying to develop. When you're trying to make somebody stronger, this is literally what you're trying to develop. You're trying to develop signals within the brain that are fast and effective and allow for the most force, the right direction of that force, the right timing of that force, the right muscle contractions at the right times. This is what you're trying to develop, is this right here. And this is how it works within the brain itself. And then what happens is this gets built by learning, right? So when we look at skill adaptation, skill acquisition, what we're trying to do is we're trying to create an environment so that that person trying to learn this skill learns how to do this, right? So it requires variability of movement, and it requires them being present in the moment, having attention and focus, and it requires them doing that over and over, right? So like that repetitive process of it. Now, the problem that you tend to see a lot of times in terms of like acquiring skills with beginners is you have a beginner come in and you just give them some squat, bench, and deadlift, and it's all about volumes and intensities, right? So you're giving them the comp lifts, and what they're doing is, so let's say they have a squat pattern where the chest falls forward as they're coming up out of the hole, right? That chest fall pattern. So what you're doing is you're creating a very efficient, a very effective chest fall pattern squat. Over time, the thicker and thicker this gets, the harder it is to break this down because it becomes so embedded, right? So there's this weird paradox that happens in terms of skill acquisition where we're constantly trying to find more efficient and effective ways to move, but at the same time, we're trying to make those movements habitual, right? So now you don't even think about walking anymore. You just do it. It allows your unconscious brain to focus on a bunch of other things. So somebody like Tom Brady can't throw a pass if he's so focused on where his feet have to go, right? But he's able to take in all of this other unconscious information, and he's able to pay attention to it and use it for information because he doesn't have to spend so much energy on worrying about where his feet goes. So it's this weird paradox of we're always trying to move better, but at the same time, we're always trying to make movements habitual. The second you make that negative pattern habitual, it's really hard to break it down and to make a more efficient pattern, okay? Also, like, in terms of skill, technical skill, that stuff breaks down very quick. So if you don't use something, you haven't done something for a period of time, it's really hard to, there's kind of like a two-way thing here because you don't forget how to ride a bike, right? I haven't rode a bike in years and I could jump on one and probably still ride it. Might take me a minute to figure it out, but it's going to happen quick because muscle memory is a thing. And this is why it's a thing. The thicker it is, the longer and harder it is to degrade. But over time, with aging and stuff, the myelin actually decreases in size. But in the stuff that I've read, it looks like even into later adult years, you can actually build hypertrophy in this myelin. You can build more myelin, more white matter within the brain. And resistance training is actually a really good way to do that. So, you know, it's why it's important as we age. Like powerlifting is a sport that we can participate in later in life, and it actually probably has benefits in terms of our, for us not losing our fucking minds. But what we got to be careful of is building that habit because it is really hard to break down. But technical skills, so I'll remember how to throw a baseball, but to be able to throw it with the precision and the accuracy necessary to be extremely competitive, that's going to be a lot different, right? I haven't shot a basketball in years. I remember how, and I know how to shoot a basketball, but the accuracy and the precision of being able to actually make baskets would probably be deteriorated by now because it's been years since I've done something like that. So if you're constantly taking time off, right, those acquired skills kind of just get pushed aside and they're even more habitual than they were before, right? So it's why it's hard to kind of build a skill if you're not consistent with something. I didn't do a good job explaining that, but
I think you did.
The end message. Yeah. If you're not consistent, it breaks down pretty quick. And the thing is like creating more myelin requires a massive amount of energy. So it's going to be worth it for your body to want to do it. So it's why also you can't just come in, do one squat and expect these changes to be made. There's consistent energy that's necessary in order for your body to be like, okay, we got to take a lot of these resources and put it towards this, right? But the more you focus, the more you're involved in training, the more the brain is in that task, the better that this happens, right? So like, I always think of like bodybuilders having that like muscle mind connection and stuff. There's probably something to that, right? There's a reason why they talk about it, even though like scientifically it might be very hard to prove. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to build effective, efficient movement. This has to be done quickly. And this is even like the force output of our muscles is dictated by this. I know it's hard to like imagine, but there's a reason why like a bodybuilder who might never do complex movements like squats can't squat as much as a 66 kilogram male lifter, even though he outweighs him by over 100 pounds, right? So we see smaller lifters that are much stronger than bigger people all of the time. And it's because they have much more effective and efficient signals within the brain. That allows that force output, the timing, the muscles, all of that stuff. It's responsible for all of it, right? And there's probably a piece of that that supplies the adaptation, the physiological adaptations that come along with training consistently. But what we want is we want to develop this, and to do so, you need to pay attention to it. It's just like learning anything.
I'm sorry.
So you need to pay attention when you're learning stuff, right? So like we've all been there where we're reading a book and you're not really paying attention to what you're reading. And then you're like, what the fuck did I just read, right? Or you're driving and you're like, how did I just get home?
Oh.
Right? And
yes.
like, it's because it's such a habitual process.
Or like
at
you're
this point.
texting.
Yeah, well, you
You're
should
driving.
be texting while driving. But those things happen to us all the time because those tasks that we do are now just habitual. You're just doing it over and over. You're not stressing it more to make it better. So having variations that make somebody pay attention in training, right? So if you have a weird bar, you have a box, you have bands and chains that change kind of the force output of the lift. It's constantly making the brain learn and figure shit out, right? So when you look at like even something like composing music, right? Like famous musical composers or chess grandmasters, or I mean, these are the things that they typically study with these things. What they do is they learn how to read music, they learn how to write music, they tend to copy others' works. And after a long time of doing that, they then start to do their own individual style of things, right? And it's kind of the same thing that we need to do here, where you kind of just teach the brain give it all these different problems to solve within the context of the movement that you're trying to get better at, right? So a box squat, a wide stance squat, a close stance squat, high bar, low bar, cambered bar, safety squat bar, they're all squats. And they're all within the context of that skill, but you're creating an environment where the brain has to pay attention and it has to constantly learn these new ways of doing things, right? In order to solve the problem that it's been given. And the smarter you can make the brain at solving those movement problems within the context of a specific skill, the greater that skill is going to be, because the greater the myelin thickness that you're going to create. So the more efficient and the more effective those signals are going to be occurring within the brain itself. So you obviously need it to be directed. It just can't be random either, right? So when you take that person with a chest fall pattern, that's how they want to do things, right? So that's the way that they're doing things now. And you want to teach them, no, we don't want it to be done this way. We want it to be done that way. My words can't really make this happen. It communicates what I want them to focus on. I mean, you don't listen to me anyways, so even if they could, it wouldn't even matter. But it allows them to have that area to focus on, so 1 to 2 things to focus on, so that they're paying attention, they're focusing in training, and they're learning, so that this is happening when they're actually involved. So like, I've heard deliberate practice as a term for this, deep practice as a term for this, and this has been very well researched. And you can get better in a fraction of the time by doing these things. And mindless practice isn't, so I see this on the internet all the time, where it's like, we're doing reps for practice. Just scheduling reps within the comp lifts without context is not practice. That's how you create bad habits. So Caleb Williams had said this on the podcast, and I think this goes perfectly here, is practice doesn't make perfect. Perfect practice makes perfect. If you're just mindlessly going through reps, you're literally just creating bad habits. And I think what people want to do a lot of times too, it's like, you see these two camps where for technique, we're just gonna lift really light, where you're not creating an efficient signaling for when it gets heavy, especially if there's a psychological arousal piece to it. Like that just brings in more noise into this, right? Or then you have other people who are like, technique doesn't matter, so they just lift heavy all the time. And it's the same thing. You're creating bad habits, because under heavier weights, stuff is going to break down. So you need to create an environment that allows them to lift heavy, that allows them to focus on technique, and allows them to constantly explore movement solutions to the problems that you're giving them within training, within context of a given skill. So if I want them to squat a particular way, I got to set up training. So I like to teach the squat where they sit back. They get a lot of box squats for that. You get that external cue to sit back more than you typically would. It just reminds you to do that. And you do that enough, eventually, they start sitting back in their squats. So this is why you need to have some heuristics to guide these things too. And I think what happens a lot of times is it's very hard to do this over the internet. So then you just get these programs that are just do this many comp lifts and we'll adjust. Load management is everything and it doesn't matter in the skill adaptation aspects of things. And what you get is you get some people who just really like it enough that they're involved in training, they're paying attention, they're focusing, they're studying how other people do it, they're trying to do it better themselves, and they're really being accountable for their own actions. That's how you develop this, right? That better signaling. But then you have other people who think it's all within the program, so they're just checking a box. And they're checking a box to do those sets and reps, and all they're doing is developing bad habits. So they're not going to develop in the same way that somebody who's paying attention, focused, and actually exploring and teaching those cognition is a part of skill, of showing your skills, right? So the brain has to pre-plan movement strategies. If it just happened, if everything was just based off of the feedback, there'd be too much of a delay. So it has to be pre-planned. So you're always trying to pick up these cues, right? So visually in a lot of sports, you're picking up on where your players are, defenders are. And a lot of times they leave your field of view, but you still have this mental representation of where everything's going and what's happening. And that's developed over gaining experience. The same thing has to happen in this sport, but you can't see the bar. You don't have that visual piece to it, but the body still has to pre-plan those movement strategies. So it's going to rely on the feedback of where the bar is resting on the skin, you actually being kind of aware of what's happening as you're coming up. So if somebody's chest is falling forward and they're not paying attention to it, and that's just fine for them because they're standing up, they're not going to fix it because they're not going to have the attention and the focus on fixing it. So it's really important that they understand that they need to change it, that they're part of the process in terms of having the attention and the focus and understanding, and they should be filming it, looking at it, doing all those things. But the coach can put them in positions. So if they have to sit way back on a box, they can't pitch forward. They literally won't be able to get off of the box if they do it right. So it's going to be driving the hips forward, chest back, hips forward, chest back. So they learn how to do that. You can give them pin squats, stuff that really enhances their awareness to those types of technical inefficiencies. But a lot of times the weight has to be heavy enough in order for them to be aware of it. Because sometimes you can manipulate things with lighter weights. It's very different than what they're going to be at for heavier weights. And the thing about powerlifting, even though it's objective and you think it's a low skilled sport, to squat 600 and then to squat 610 pounds even, it's new skill development. This has to continue to get better and better and better in order for your progress to keep getting better and better and better. So the brain's role, it is a skill. Displaying strength is a skill. And this is literally what's happening to display that skill. It's not, yes, volumes and intensities and all of that stuff, of course that's important. But there needs to be a lot more context to it. And I think people really miss the mark. It's a sport that, people just kind of regurgitate the words of the ones that they like. And the programs are very simple. You just throw some RPEs on it, so you're not even in charge of putting loads. But your job as a coach is to create a learning environment for them to learn movement solutions that are going to yield the best results for them within the context of the sport. Does that make sense, Jess?
Yeah.
Questions?
I did have one earlier and I was trying to ask, but I didn't want to interrupt you and now I kind of forget what it was. It was when you were talking about I forget. I'm sorry.
You don't remember what it was?
I don't, but it was a legitimate question. I'm trying to remember if it had to do with oh, well, I guess this isn't really what the question is, but what made you start looking into this more? 'Cause you said you've always thought about this, but I don't think I've ever really heard you explain it.
So I have I mean, this is where the dynamic systems theory comes from.
Okay.
Right, so like skill acquisition has
Yeah.
always been something that's interested me.
Yes.
And I think it's because it's more of an encompassing, it encompasses everything, right? So knowing that there's feedback coming from the muscles, all of that stuff, but there's also the brain's role in displaying strength or displaying a skill. I think oftentimes strength sports, it's just viewed on the actual like volumes and intensities and muscle size, and you very rarely see, because technique's not a big,
Oh, I see.
as long as you're squatting to depth, it's fine, right? And it's like, maybe depending on how the person's squatting and stuff, but even then, the more that we all will look at early specialization, right? So like youth athletes, you tell them to play multiple sports all the time, right? Don't just focus on one, play a bunch of different sports, all of that stuff, right? This is the same thing. So like having them squat wide, close, high bar, safety squat bar, camera bar, it's just creating a well-rounded athlete with more skills. And I think that gets forgotten in this sport because it's just viewed upon in a really physiological way, as opposed to like, now the human has a brain and the brain's probably more responsible. Neuroscience wasn't huge during the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s when a lot of the strength research was coming out. So it was just viewed from the muscle cell out, not from the brain down, and understanding that's this like synchronous process between the two, and there's just constant updating of information and rewiring that's kind of happening in order to make those things happen. In order for you to put 5 pounds on, it requires a lot of energy and a lot of resources, and making this a hell of a lot better just to put 5 more pounds on. Like this plays a really important role in that. And what happens is when this is thinner too, right? So like you get a lot of beginner clients that they have they have terrible coordination and skill within the sport, right?
Yeah.
And there's just a lot of noise within the system. So things that you can do, and I'll get into why hypertrophy might be important too. So with a lot of noise, if we slow down, right, that speed accuracy trade-off. So if I slow the movement down, the accuracy is going to increase because it decreases the noise. So that's where you might give pause squats to somebody in the beginning, right? Because it's slowing them down, decreasing the noise, but they're going to have to move faster under regular weights. So then you get the other group that's like, move fast with everything. But if you do that, your precision of movement tends to decrease. So there's going to be a balance, and it's probably going to be well trained within all of it. There's a right time and a wrong time for it. It's not just like somebody's fallen over in the hole, so we should do a pause squat there. It's understanding that speed accuracy trade-off with that and how to decrease noise within the system. Another thing that decreases noise is the more motor units within a muscle, the lower the noise. So some of your beginner clients, if they're just squatting, benching, and deadlifting, and they haven't really done much in terms of like being around a gym and lifting weights or playing sports, they probably don't have a lot of motor units to begin with, right? They haven't developed complex movement strategies for changing environmental conditions, for, you know, I know you played tennis, right? So like there's certain skills that you're going to develop from playing that sport, like in terms of like movement strategies to do certain things, right? So like even for me, like doing the MMA stuff, the first day I did MMA, it wasn't that I'm a brand new, I've never done any of this stuff. There's carryover. Like throwing a baseball is very similar to throwing a punch, right? And playing soccer, like we did a lot of small-sided stuff, and I played center mid. So a lot of times the space was very tight with somebody in front of you, and you're literally jockeying for foot position just like you would in standing up with somebody in a cage. It's not, those skills are very transferable to the next thing. But if you get beginners who don't have a lot of skills other than like walking, sitting down, like typical things that you do on a day-to-day basis, they don't have a lot to draw on. So they just don't have many of these lined up to help them out. And even then, like you get certain people who play certain sports, so like range of motion, right? The greater the range of motion, the more noise, right? So somebody who's really athletic and good at basketball is probably not going to be a great power lifter just because of the genetic leverages and stuff. There's just going to be more noise to try to complete those tasks because they're bigger and they have to go a longer way. The way that you can decrease that is you get bigger as well. So like gaining weight, right? So like if my chest gets bigger, my belly gets bigger, my bench range of motion gets shorter, right? So like those types of things. You spread your feet wider and wider on a squat, you're decreasing the range of motion, so you're decreasing the noise within the system. And I get it, like oh, well, somebody might not be strong in those positions. Well, it's your job as a coach to make them strong in those positions.
You were going to say something about hypertrophy?
So that was the motor unit piece.
Okay.
So using hypertrophy training, right, it increases the amount of motor units that you have within each muscle, which actually decreases the noise. So hypertrophy training might have a place utilizing this perspective. So all of the things that we've known that have worked for people over time, and I get it, some things work for some and don't for others and all that stuff, but the general ideas stick around because they are ultimately effective for a reason. And I think from a hypertrophy standpoint, just a simplistic improving motor units within a muscle decreases noise. And I also think it kind of updates, right? So if you're getting that sensory feedback, you know, your hamstrings might be telling the brain all the time that like, yo, we're weak, leave us alone. And then all of a sudden you start hammering them with a lot of exercises, good morning, stuff like that. Eventually the system gets updated. It's like, hey, the hamstrings are pretty strong. We should utilize them in some of these more complex movements and stuff. So I think like focusing training on those single piece muscles improves that sensory input that the body's getting, especially because it's always like, you always hear coaches attack those weak muscles with that bodybuilding stuff, right? So like in those two cases there, improved motor units, and it probably updates the system's information that lets them know that like, hey, this might be a good strategy to use in a more complex movement. But then you got to put them in a position to try out those strategies in a more complex movement. So like a box squat, you'd use a hamstring or a wide stance box squat, something like that. You feel me?
Yep.
All right, I'm done. You can follow me on Instagram as KWKNR Team Precision Powerlifting Systems. You can follow Jay Birdie at Jay Birdie.
That's it?
That's it. Done.